Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Puca and welcome to my symposium. I'm a PhD and a university lecturer, and this is your online resource for the academic study of magic, paganism, esotericism and all things occult. This is the recording of a talk that I gave for an event called Quantum Source, and my talk is about paganism, Wicca and more specifically Ostara, the Spring Equinox, which is what we are celebrating these days in the Northern Hemisphere. Quantum Source is an evening of live research talks that takes place roughly once a month in Farsley, on the outskirts of Leeds. My talk was recorded as part of a night celebrating springtime research, and I shared the stage with researchers investigating pregnancy and plant genetics. Follow Quantum Source on Twitter for all of their updates. And also, please remember that this project can only exist thanks to your help, so if you like my project and want me to keep the academic fund going, please consider supporting my work with a one-off PayPal donations by joining memberships or my inner symposium on Patreon. Thank you for considering, and hope you enjoy the video. Let me know in the comments. And smash the like button, of course.
Alright, ladies and gents, we will reconvene if you are sitting comfortably. Yes, thank you. Right, who's in celebratory, jubilant mode? Yes, of course you are, right. Wonderful to hear, because of course there is a lot to celebrate around springtime. It is the return to life, and there are lots of cultures around the place who really do celebrate those return to life, the change from those dark winter days into the brighter, warmer spring days. Hey! Yeah, absolutely. So, in order to celebrate this one, I was just wondering if I can put a call out for volunteers. We're going to do our own little Quantum Source reenactment of, I don't know if you've seen the movie The Wicker Man, but you know, you could come and get involved potentially. Go live, some pagan practices here. I'm also putting out someone for a role of the Christopher Lee character. There's also going to be an unfortunate individual who takes this and fills the role of the unfortunate Edward Woodward. This role doesn't end too well, I have to say. Spoiler alert, but yes, not the best ending for Edward Woodward there. Yeah. At Quantum Source, we don't like to stereotype anything. We don't like to stereotype pagan practices and what they may well be getting up to. So let's find out what those pagan practices actually involve. So please give it up from Leeds Trinity University, researcher in religious studies, Dr. Puca.
Hello. I feel like after that introduction, people are expecting something very specific. But yeah, I will be talking about paganism and pagan celebrations with a specific, we will address specifically the Spring Equinox, since we are around the time of the year. But I don't know, how many of you are familiar with paganism, contemporary paganism that is? A few of you, okay. But so that we, in order for us to understand each other, I will be covering what paganism is as well. And sometimes they say, if you ask 10 pagans what paganism is, you will get 11 answers. I think it's 20 actually, but we can be, yeah, which means that for us researchers on the matter, it's very complicated to, analyze the data that we get from fieldwork. Because my research is mainly anthropological, so I work with people. So what is paganism? And in some cases it is defined as neo-paganism, meaning the contemporary practice paganism. But now researchers are moving away from this definition because some people consider the neo as being, in a way, derogatory or undermining of the practice. Saying, sort of underlying that it is somehow fabricated, and a lot of practitioners are not happy with this. So researchers are now preferring contemporary paganism rather than new paganism. So according to the Pagan Federation International, it is a polytheistic and pantheistic nature-worshipping religion, and it is based on pre-Christian or non-Christian religions, more specifically in Europe, and that's why the emphasis is on Christianity specifically, because that's the dominant religious system. These practices tend to be based on beliefs and mythologies that predate Christianity or that have lived and survived alongside Christianity. It is also, there was a revival in a reappropriation of the term pagan in the Renaissance, especially in the Italian Renaissance. There was the idea of using the term pagan with a positive connotation, because it started out as a way of, sort of as a derogatory term towards those that were not converting to Christianity, and it was a way of saying, the villagers, because pagan comes from paganus, from somebody who lives in this rural area and is not educated enough to, know what the true path is, and so it was a way, a derogatory way of addressing those who were reticent to convert to Christianity. So there was a reappropriation in the Renaissance, because the Renaissance had a more enchanted way of looking at the word, and we will see that is quite in line with paganism, an enchanted way of looking at the word. And also paganism has lived a rebirth, and some would argue a birth, because the way contemporary paganism is lived and perceived and conceptualized now is quite different from the past. So some would say that it is actually, it was born in the 1950s, and it was popularized worldwide by Wicca, which according to historian Professor Ronald Hutton is the only religion that Britain gave to the world. And yeah, that's interesting as well. So let's see some common principles in paganism. So the first one is a non-monotheistic relationship to the divine. So it means that the divine is not perceived as one God only, one God creator, and it's not just, and also there is a difference between monotheism and monism. So there are some pagans that could be considered monists, which means that they believe that everything is one, but not that everything comes and is created from one God, that is identified with certain characteristics and has the trait of being a creator God. So it is a non-monotheistic relationship with the divine, and it varies, but it is usually polytheistic, sometimes monist, and quite often pantheist, which means that the divine is in everything. That's what pantheism means. Also, it is non-dogmatic, not based on scriptures, and not revealed as a religion. It's not a religion that is revealed by a prophet. There are no prophets in paganism, there are no scriptures, there's no central dogma. It is based on the personal experience of the pagan and their relation to the divine that they work with. That's why in paganism it's more common to say, I'm working with Freya, or I'm working with Hecate, rather than saying I'm worshipping Freya or I'm worshipping Hecate, because it's more based on the relationship that the practitioner creates with the specific deity. Also, it is an immanent spirituality, which means that the divine is perceived as being imbued in nature, and that's why it's a nature-worshipping religion. The divine is within everything. So the chair is divine, the desk is divine, this screen is divine. Everything is imbued with divine essence. That's what immanence means. And it is opposed to the idea of transcendence, which means that the divine is outside of the material world. So that's why pagans have fun in the in the images that you saw in the introduction, because everything that sometimes you have in other religions, the idea that the material world leads you astray from the divine, because there's this kind of dichotomy between the spiritual and the material, whereas in paganism the two are completely connected. So through the material you can get and do get to the spiritual and to the divine, because the divine is immersed entrenched in everything that is, in every manifested aspect of reality. Also, there is reverence towards the land and place, and also reverence towards all tangible things. So it's not just a matter of considering divine other human beings who have a soul as opposed to other things that are just inanimate objects. Everything is imbued with life, and it is sentient, and it is divine. That's why it is sometimes called an enchanted worldview, because it sees everything as enchanted. And this comes from Max Weber, who said that after modernity we have a disenchantment of the world because we don't see the world as enchanted anymore. And with paganism, a lot of scholars, this is a buzzword among religious studies scholars, the idea of the re-enchantment of the world through paganism and other witchcraft-related practices. So other common principles are the love and communion with nature, the respect and reverence towards the eternal cycle of death and rebirth in which nature manifests itself, an ethic that recognizes the individual responsibility, so you don't have a god or a goddess. Of course you have goddesses, lots and lots of goddesses in paganism, but you don't have a deity that will punish you after death. You don't have any deity that will punish you. The idea of sin does not belong to paganism. The ethic is something that is individual, and it is something that the practitioner cultivates. It's not, you don't have an external entity or a specific religious person that will tell you what is right and what is wrong. Also, there is a recognition of the divine in both the female and male aspects. And in Wicca you have this duodeistic aspect and emphasis on the female and the male as the two polarities in nature. And now this discourse is being expanded by contemporary pagans due to the evolving cultural situation where the idea of gender is being seen more as a spectrum, perhaps, rather than as a polarity. Wicca is, as I said earlier, could be considered the only religion that Britain gave to the world, and it is what popularized paganism. Wicca is one religion within the umbrella of paganism, but I would argue that it made paganism more known to the public, even to those that are not interested or don't practice Wicca. And it is based and in a way founded on 19th century Hermetic society, for instance those practicing ceremonial magic, the Ordo Templarientis, of which Aleister Crowley, a famous occultist, was part of, and the Golden Dawn, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is perhaps the most famous order of ceremonial magic of the 20th century. And then we have that the foundation of Wicca dates back to the 1950s, with Gerald Gardner being the founder of Wicca. And it creates this new pagan tradition, and he claims that it is based on the works of a scholar who is that for pagans it is important to celebrate the changes in the world, in the seasons and on the earth, because of the believed connection between what happens outside and what happens inside. So it's not just a matter of celebrating the days that get warmer and light that gets to shine progressively more on the earth. It is about that as well. But it is also about realizing and connecting to what is outside, so that you can also be connected to what is inside. Because the belief here is that everything is interconnected. And so when you connect with the seasonal changes outside in nature, you are also connecting to your inner changes, your inner seasons, because we all go through seasons according to a pagan perspective on life and on the self. So by connecting with what is outside, you are also connecting with what is inside, and you acknowledge your own internal seasons, and by doing that, you are more connected to divine. So as for for the spring equinox, which in Wicca would be called Ostara, and this picture is taken at a Ostara ritual in Italy. It is named after the goddess Eostre, the Anglo-Saxon goddess of spring and rebirth. And it is a celebration that focuses around the rebirth or resurrection of nature. And here you have the goddess and the god that are presented as the maiden and the hunter, or alternatively as the green man and the Mother Earth. So another thing that you find in paganism, and this is something that has been popularized by Wicca, is that the festivals that celebrate the seasonal changes are part of a mythological narrative that, especially in Wicca, has been inspired by different mythologies across Europe, pre-Christian mythologies, but has been made by Wicca into a more coherent narrative, where you have the goddess and the god that alternate them. You know, they have this sort of a dance where you have that it all starts at Samhain, which is what we know as Halloween. And then at Samhain you have the death of the god, and then you have that at the winter solstice, the goddess gives birth to the god, who has sort of gone underground in the womb of the goddess, and then gets rebirth at the winter solstice. And then you have that at Imbolc, which is the 1st of February. Both are sort of pre-pubescent, in this kind of pre-pubescent state where they are purified by death and they are purified by birth as well, and they are ready to, sort of young and ready to get through the cycle of life again. Then the spring equinox, they are both like, we could compare it to being adolescents or teenagers, and they are trying to have this sort of dance, this mating dance even. They try to know each other and to get to know each other. So you can see them as this female and male polarity that are in a state of courting each other. And then at Beltane, which is, maybe it's more helpful if I look at this. At Beltane, you have the sacred wedding, in a way, between the goddess and the god, where the two mate. And then you have that Alita, the goddess, is often portrayed as being pregnant. And of course, then she gives birth at Yule. But you have that all these seasonal changes have this sort of narrative, and in some cases it is connected to certain mythologies that come from different places of pre-Christian or non-Christian Europe. There is this sort of alternation or dance between the goddess and the god, the female and the male principle, and because they are seen as these two polarities in nature that alternate and are in this state of constant evolution, and they create the death and rebirth that we see in the light that comes and goes, in the crops that die and get reborn, in everything that we see around us that is in this constant cycle of being alive but then dying, and then in a way seeing a new life again. So it is sort of based on this concept of life and death being interconnected and alternating themselves through the dance between the polarities that we have in nature, that in this case are represented as female and male, so as the goddess and the god, because they are perceived as divine. But they can, you can also articulate it in a way that is not based on this form of polarity, but in a different, you could also conceptualize it by not using these two polarities, but by seeing the principles active in nature and how they interact with each other. But in Wicca you have this polarity between male and female, or the goddess and the god. So then you have that when it comes to Ostara, or the spring equinox, the celebrations for pagans tend to center around the ideas of birth and rebirth, of course. because Ostara is about sort of approaching the state of the sacred union between the male and the female, which happens at Beltane, which is between the 31st of May and the 1st of April, or is it the 30th? I tend to always confuse the 30th and the 31st, which months have the 31st or not. So, but yeah, it's on the 1st of April. And on that occasion, you have the sacred wedding between the goddess and the god. So it is sort of the mating, the sexual encounter between the two. And so the spring equinox is approaching that state. And so it is still a festivity that has to do with birth and rebirth. And so that's why you have a lot of eggs and even bunnies. And these celebrations center around these ideas, and also revealing the life force that has always been there, concealed by the winter's cloak. And it's interesting because I once attended a pagan ritual during my fieldwork in Italy, and quite often when you have pagan rituals, you have a priestess and a priest who embody during the ritual the goddess and the god, and then you have reenactment, a ritual reenactment of what is happening in the world outside, in the seasonal changes, in a way that is sort of a narrative created by the priestess and the priest. And in some cases when they are present in the ritual, also by the elements. So at this ritual that I participated at, you had the priestess and the priest. The priestess would embody the goddess and the priest the god, and then you would have other four practitioners that were calling upon the elements. So you would have one for air, one for fire, one for earth, and one for water. And so what would happen during this ritual is that after casting the circle, so creating the sacred space, this was in a natural space, of course, and because that's what often happens with pagans. I should have said that and not sort of assume that you would know. But yeah, pagans quite often celebrate in nature. And they had cast the circle. They would have the four people representing the elements calling upon air, fire, water, and earth. And then you would have the priest calling the goddess in the body of the priestess for the time of the celebration, and the priestess calling upon the god to sort of enter the body of the priest for the duration of the celebration. And then after that, to represent what was happening in the world, in the season, the priestess would sort of have this slow dance going through the people representing the elements, and she would get something on her body that would, there was sort of a gift from each of the elements. So for instance, I remember that the water would give her a necklace with seashells, and then you had this dance where every element would give something to the priestess to wear on her body. And so the idea is that the body of the goddess, so the earth, is getting dressed again by the elements. So then representing that the earth is now flourishing, and that all the elements in the world are allowing her body to be rich with what the different elements have to give her, whether it be whether it comes from water or air or fire or what's the one that I'm forgetting? Air, fire, water, and earth. And air, yes. they are still four. So some examples are, that they would do during these kind of rituals are planting seeds, painting eggs, egg hunting, and so on. So for instance, at this ritual that I was talking about, after the goddess being sort of dressed up again by all the elements because nature is getting rebirth, she would have this sort of mating, it's not really a mating dance, but more like a courting dance with God. And it would just end at this kind of dance, and after that the priestess and the priest would give the participants some seeds so that they could charge those seeds with what they wanted to grow in their life. And so there was this kind of representation of the seeds that get planted and give, a certain result, a certain plant that flourishes with something that you want to achieve in your life, that you charge those seeds with that intent, plant them, and as the plant grows, the plant is imbued with your intent, and so that would also manifest in your life. So it was also part of the ritual. So you would also have quite often, not always, but quite often you would also have a magical component, a magical element in these kind of rituals, because I didn't mention earlier, but in paganism, I wouldn't say that all pagans practice magic, but I say that the majority of pagans believe in magic, and quite a lot of them practice magic. Or they have a belief system that encompasses magic as something that is, the word real would imply a long conversation, but something that is part of their framework. So in rituals, there's a mimesis of the dynamics carried out by the male and the female principles in nature, which is something that I was expressing earlier. So for instance, even in the, over there, as you can see, there's the pentacle. The pentacle is a symbol that is often worn by pagans, and it represents the four elements. The upper point represents the spirit, and then the circle around it represents the ongoing process of creation in the world, and the perpetual nature, the eternity, that bounds all these elements together, binds all these elements together. Also, as I said, there are also magical practices. For instance, charging and planting seeds for an intended purpose, or egg painting to make something fertile or bring abundance, or there are also rituals for prosperity, fertility, and new growth. So even when it comes to magic practice in paganism, you would have the different seasons are associated with specific intents. So for instance, if Samhain is associated with death, Samhain would be Halloween, around Halloween. If Samhain is associated with death, then it means that you can, it is advisable perhaps, some pagans would do magic rituals to allow something that they don't want in their life to die out, or to, whether it be, a specific vice that they want to abandon, or something, something about themselves or something about their lives that they want to leave behind. That would be the perfect time of the year. Just as the different moon phases for pagans are associated to different intents. So the waning moon is more about decreasing things and having things diminished, and the waxing moon is about allowing things to grow. So if you want to bring something in your life that requires to add something that is creative and add something, the waxing moon is considered to be the right time, the right moon phase, as opposed to the waning moon that is associated to decreasing and even warding off. So it's fascinating also how pagans include in this enchanted worldview also the belief in magic and the practice of magic, which is considered not just to be a practice that is about achieving things in your life, but also a practice that allows you to be in contact with the divine. Because if you have the framework, if you have the belief system that everything is divine, that you don't just have the gods out there and then here we are disconnected from the divine. Everything is divine, so everything is interconnected. As a consequence, you have that magic is considered to be possible because it is leveraging on those connections in a way that allows for things even that are apparently at a distance and apparently not connected on the material world to affect a change, because they are indeed connected on a subtle level. Which reminds me of a quote attributed to Galileo Galilei, which I often use on my social media, which says, things are connected by invisible ties, you cannot pick a flower without upsetting the star. And it was a common, it was an interesting belief that you have in Renaissance philosophy, especially Italian Renaissance philosophy, this idea of things being interconnected, and the fact that even if you don't see the tie that links two things that are not visibly connected, they are still affecting each other, even at a distance. Even if you don't see it, the change is going to occur. So that's what I wanted to say, and these are some further readings in case you're interested, and I look forward to your questions.